Copyright in these lectures is either owned by the ANU or a third party who has licensed the ANU to use it. Students may transcribe or make notes from any lecture for the purpose of personal study only. No lecture may be copied, reproduced or communicated other than for the uses described above without the prior permission of the ANU.
All right, can I call you all into listening mode, the more so since that is the subject of... that's the subject of this evening's talk. I'm Nick Evans and I'm the director of the newly created ARC Centre of Excellence for the Dynamics of Language that is centred here at the ANU, but we have three collaborating institutions at University of Western Sydney, where Anne Cutler is from, University of Melbourne and University of Queensland, and many other partner institutions, too numerous to name, in Australia and overseas. And over the next 7 years, it's our goal to solve a number of questions, ask a number of questions about the nature of language and languages, with a particular focus on diversity and on dynamism, that is, languages as dynamic, changing systems. And one of the reasons for doing that is the growing linguistic diversity of this continent and our recognition that we live in a multilingual world, and also our recognition that this is a country that doesn't do a very good job of dealing with that in many ways, including very low levels of achievement in the learning of second and other languages. Part of our goal is to make language and languages an abiding and fascinating theme in public discussion, and I don't think it really is nearly enough. And part of that is that every year when we hold our Summerfest, which is a week-long engagement of centre members and others with ideas and research on languages, we will hold a public lecture by someone who really has something interesting to say on a topic, and that is of broad relevance to a whole range of people. And I think it's very suitable that as our opening Summerfest, our opening public lecture, we have Professor Anne Cutler, one of the members of our centre and the leader of the processing program within it, as the speaker. Now, I don't want to rob Anne of much presentation time, but I do want to just say a couple of important things. As you will hear very soon, Anne is an Aussie, and she has returned to Australia since 2013 after an extremely distinguished career that included taking a PhD at University of Austin in Texas, time at Cambridge, and then 20 years as a director of the Max Planck Institute for Psycholinguistics in Nijmegen, the Netherlands, from 1993 to 2003. Sorry, 2013. And through that time, Anne has really been at the forefront, and you could say the person who created a field of studying how we listen differently to different languages and how that is shaped by the language that we have learned as typically as a mother tongue. Now, I'm assuming that most of you are here tonight because you're interested in language, and that most or many of you have struggled with either learning or teaching or both one or more other languages. And although that's a quest with many, many aspects to it, it does start from the beginning with mastering sounds, first listening them and then producing them. So that's why the topic of listening is so central. If I was to recommend one thing for you to do after you leave the room, this huge book But I should stress that despite its size, it's incredibly readable. It's one of these sort of miracles of writing where every sentence seems to sit on a vast edifice of research and experimentation, but at the same time is easy to process and makes sense and forms part of a very large and well-constructed argument, which we'll hear some parts of tonight. So this brings together literally hundreds of scientific papers that it's based on, both by Anna and many of people who have worked closely with her. Since returning to Australia in 2013, Anne has held the position of research chair at the Marx Institute at UWS, and it's thanks to that fortunate circumstance that she was in the country and able to participate in putting together the very interesting team of people that we have in our centre. Just to finish with one final biographical remark, Anne studied German and psychology as an undergraduate at the University of Melbourne, and we were talking once about what leads people to study languages, and one could ask it in the Australian context, what leads people to not study language, which was my own case because I didn't have the world's greatest teachers and I retreated very quickly from the language classroom at high school, only to sort of approach much later. But in Anne's case, she said that the great thing about it was she had a chance to study with people who they were actually displaced, so it was sort of fruit of the tragedies of World War II, but at her school in Tasmania, she was taught by people who had to leave post-war-torn Europe and come to Australia, who were actually very highly qualified, passionate people. In one case, her German teacher being someone with a PhD in philosophy, and bringing that into the classroom. And of course, you can never exactly reproduce historical circumstances, but it's a reminder that it takes a very special sort of person to really instill the love of language, and we as a country need to recognise that, to value it. There are, of course, other political issues about how far we now extend the hand of welcome to the people who would be the 2014 or 2020 equivalents of the people who Anne was so lucky to study with in the time she was at school. So without further ado, I'd like to hand over the floor to Anne Cutler and invite you to welcome her with me. You might want to look it up. No.
Thank you very much, Nick. I hope you can hear me. I do walk around a lot, and if you can't hear me, if I start to walk out here, and can you still hear me up the back if I do that? Oh, you can. That's wonderful. I'll tell you what. If I become inaudible, it's your task to start waving your hands or something so that I go back to the microphone. Okay? So keep me in the picture if I do that. So, how the language we speak guides the way we listen is get down to business. the topic today, and we actually start listening to speech even before we're born. I'm not going to go into that evidence today, but there have been a lot of studies showing that within an hour of being born, babies will prefer to listen to their native language, the language they've heard in the womb. They'll prefer to listen to their mother's voice and even prefer to listen to stories and poems that have been read to them while they were still inside their mother. So you can hear a lot before you're born. You get born knowing something about your language. And from that point on, or actually from even before birth, your native language is training you to listen to speech in the most efficient possible way for that language. And what I'm going to be talking about today is really at the micro level. This is happening all through your language, every part of your language, so it includes the words and the sentence structures and the meanings that are typical of your language. But today I'm going to concentrate on the sounds of your language and what is actually happening. I mean, listening is such a phenomenally complex operation. Because what I'm doing here is I'm making the air move in this room. And it's hitting your ears. But miraculously, you're understanding something out of that. But that's all I'm doing, right? I'm making the air move, and it's hitting your ears. So when we're listening to speech, we are constantly at microsecond by microsecond entertaining hypotheses about what is being said, juggling possibilities, and efficiently zeroing in on what actually is in the speech signal that's coming in. But because we do it in the most efficient way for our language, it might not be the most efficient way for another language. Okay? So it can happen that in a couple of different languages, you have exactly the same speech information, but you use it differently in each language. And so I'm going to give you a couple of examples of that. But let's start with listening to some speech. Now I'm going to give you a task to do, right? I'm going to play you 5 different utterances, different sentences, and the first 5 are not going to be in English. And your task is just to tell me how many different speakers there are. There are 5 different sentences, but how many different talkers? Just so the easiest way to do this is you listen to one, and then when the next one comes in, you say, was that the same or not? Right? And then the third one, you compare them against the previous one. So listen to this.
Als je nog eens hier komt zwemmen, neem dan vooral een handdoek mee.
Can you hear it?
Het kind bracht zijn ouders tot schater met zijn imitatie van de lerares.
Nauwelijks was het concert uit of een daverend applaus brak los.
Plotseling realiseerde ze zich dat ze het zwervende leven moe was.
Niemand heeft ooit kunnen achterhalen waar het geld terechtgekomen is.
So bear in mind, so just keep it to yourself at the moment. How many different, it could be all the same, 2 different speakers, 3 different, 4 different, or 5 different speakers. And now we're going to do it again. These ones are going to be in English.
The recent rainfall has caused very severe damage in the higher valleys.
The local train left the station more than 5 minutes ago.
Nobody noticed when the children slipped away just after dinner.
The young boy got up quite early in order to watch the sunrise.
This rugby season promises to be a very exciting one.
Okay. It's not an easy task, is it? This is a forensic. Is there any Dutch people in the room? All right, Dutch people. How many speakers were there in the Dutch?
I would say 3.
I've got to look it up, actually. Right. What did the rest of you think? How many, the Australian English speakers, how many different Australian English speakers? How many, anybody for 5? I didn't hear any 5s. 4? 3? 2? And it wasn't, obviously it wasn't all the same one. Well, the 4s were correct. It's a very, very difficult task, and it's well known in forensic phonetics You know, in forensic phonetics, they you might have to find out whether somebody is hearing, you know, somebody who overheard people planning a crime or something, and they've told the police, and then you bring them in and say, now, is this the same voice you heard? Or which of these two voices is the one you heard? It's really, really hard. But one thing that is really well known is that it's much easier to do that task in your native language. Right? Now, it seems like that makes sense because it would be easier if you understood and so on. That's got nothing to do with understanding. Okay, and how do we know it's got nothing to do with understanding? Because you can do it at 7 months. And I don't know if you ever had a conversation with a 7-month-old, but they don't understand an awful lot. So how do we know that infants can discriminate between speakers? Okay, we're not asking them to choose, we're not asking them to count, but we're asking whether they can discriminate between, for instance, a set of 3 speakers and then adding a 4th one in. Okay, and so how you test discrimination is that you bring an infant into the laboratory and you're playing some audio, and there's also something going on the screen, and as you see, the infant is sitting on mum's lap, and mum is listening to something completely different over headphones, like a CD that she brought along or something. So mum doesn't know what the infant is hearing, but the infant is hearing. Now, in this case, in this experiment, it was, except I think this photograph isn't actually from this experiment, because that's not a 7-month-old, but the infants were hearing exactly those sentences that you just heard. So not particularly spoken to infants, just ordinary utterances by people, women of the same age roughly as their mothers. And what happens is that the infant is looking at something on the screen and hearing something that is going on, repeating, going on. In this case, just different sentences spoken by these different women. And it just carries on, and infant keeps listening, and the stimuli carry on, and the infant keeps listening, and the audio carries on. And at some point, the infant doesn't listen anymore and gets bored. And so at that point, when that happens, when the infant looks away from the screen and is bored, then you change the audio input. So in this case, we changed from having 3 speakers to bringing in a 4th speaker into the mix. Now, if the infant can discriminate between speakers, say it's not that same 3, it's a 4th one, there's something new going on. These are all strange speakers, nobody they know, you know. But if they can pick the fact that you've added a new one, then they will perk up and look again at and attend more again, and that will show that they have actually noticed. They discriminated the speakers, and they've noticed that a new one has been added in. So we asked if the 7-month-olds could notice if a new talker was added to making it 4 voices instead of 3, saying sentences such as exactly the ones you heard. Well, these were in fact Dutch babies, so they were the Dutch sentences that you heard. And the answer is yes, they absolutely could. But if we did it with Japanese sentences, no, and not with Italian either. So they can only do it in their native language. In other words, the ability to discriminate between talkers is better in the native language at 7 months already. And that's not understanding, right? What it is appreciating the familiar sounds. So at 7 months, between 5 months and 12 months, roughly, the infant is zeroing in on the general sound patterns of the native language. Okay. So what we're going to talk about is ways in which this results in, even from that early point, the differences between languages that guide the way we listen. So you know that listening to speech is about the most efficient thing you do in your life. It's automatic. It's just extremely quick. And as I said earlier, it's continuous, and we're entertaining alternative interpretations, possible hypotheses in parallel as we listen, and we're using every possible part of the speech signal that's relevant. So it's the vowels, it's the consonants. In a tone language, we're processing the tones. In a stress language, there's stress to process. There's also the intonation of the sentence, which can help us. And I'm going to show you that there is a very interesting thing that happens with stress. So I'm talking now about the stress patterns that distinguish. So, for instance, the noun pervert and the verb pervert, right? So they have the same vowels and consonants, but as you can see, there's a big difference. I mean, there are clear. This is a spectrogram up the top and a waveform down the bottom, and so you can see that the two syllables in each case, right? And you can see that in the noun, the first syllable is much longer than it is in the verb, you see, and the amplitude, it's much louder, and the second syllable in the verb is much louder and longer than the second syllable in the noun. And there's a lot you can see in a visual representation of speech, actually. So there are some people in this room who can even tell whether the person who spoke that utterance, which variety of English they spoke, whether it's Australian English or British English or American English. Anybody? Because Janet Fletcher has gone back to Melbourne. Any spectrogram readers in here? Can tell me? Oh, too bad. You linguists, a room full of linguists? Come on. No, it's not Australian, it's American. It's American, they're both American. It's American. Thank you, Tony. It's American, and you can tell because there's a little wiggle here. This has got nothing to do with the talk. I'm just giving you, little extract from Spectrogram Reading 101. That little wiggle there is a sound, and if an Australian or a British person had said that, there wouldn't be a in pervert, right? It would just be pervert. Okay. You can forget that. It's just fun. The point is that there is a lot of difference between stressed syllables and unstressed syllables in English. And in fact, you can even have unrelated pairs of words. Of course, pervert and pervert are related. Well, you can have unrelated pairs that have exactly the same vowels and consonants and differ in stress. So you have insight in English and insight, and relay and relay, forbear and forbear, trustee, trustee. Actually, stress languages don't have a lot of those pairs. Any stress language doesn't have many such pairs. And what really is the most important thing you can do with stress is you can distinguish between two words that begin in the same way, except that one has initial stress and the other one doesn't. And as I told you, as I said earlier, the most important thing is how quickly you are entertaining these hypotheses and deciding on the right one. Okay, so you want to be able to get rid of alternative candidate words that are not what is actually being spoken. So, for instance, you can hear carton or cartoon, and if you can know already in the first syllable which one it is, then you're stealing a march on somebody who can't, right? You're understanding quicker. Campus, campaign, cashew, cashier, and so on, right? And so how quickly can we actually tell? Okay, here you go again. Now I'm going to ask you, I'm going to play the first syllable to you, and you've got to decide whether it's motive or motel. Okay, so you can just remember whether it's the one with the stress has capital letters. So motive is stressed on the first syllable and motel on the second syllable. So you just remember, and I'll tell you on the next overhead. So there's not much to hear, is there, in the first syllable? It's short, but it's taken out of a real recording of one or other of those words. Okay, I'll do the first one again. Distant or distinct?
Type. Camp.
Okay.
Cut.
It's not easy. Well, we'll see what people did in an experiment. Australian listeners in experiment, and those were actually the stimuli that they heard in the experiment, a small sample of what they actually heard in the experiment. So you have to guess, for instance, whether it was muse from music or museum. And if it was from music, they were about 75% correct on average. Now, you all made this choice. So I mean, when we actually go back and so was the first one who heard motive and who heard motel? Mm-hmm. Distant or distant in the second one? Or distinct? You want to play it again? Typhus? Typhoon. Good question. I hoped you would remember it. Campus or campus? Campaign? Mm-hmm. Music? Museum? You guys are pretty good, actually. Cartoon? Cartoon? You're pretty good. You're better than the people in the experiment. Because in general, what the Australian English listeners in the experiment did was that they nearly always went for the initial stress option, right? And in fact, in the non-stressed, the muse from museum, on the right of the slide here, on the right of the graph, they were significantly worse than chance, right? That's 40%, and chance is 50%. They were worse than chance, right? And whereas you guys were better, and what you actually heard was the only campus was the initial stressed one, and all the others were secondary stressed, and many of you got it 100% right, I think. Bravo. So maybe it was you were following the Dutch people, because when we did this experiment, it was a bit shocking to us that the English listeners were not so good at this task, especially since the Dutch speakers are very good in their native language, and they turned out to do, even when we gave them the English, especially with the unstressed cases, the museum cases, the Dutch listeners outdid the English in the English people's native language. So why Dutch? You know, where did Dutch come in, apart from the fact that I lived in the Netherlands for 20 years and did all my experiments there? But why Dutch? Well, Dutch and English are very, very similar languages, and they're both actually stress languages, and the stress system in Dutch and English is very, very similar, extremely similar. So the stress rules are just about identical. The only thing that is different is that the number of words in Dutch with an unstressed but full vowel, like muse in museum, is much greater than the number of such words in English. Now, there is a huge difference between, so I play you both of them at once. So muse for music sounds like this. And this is the one you heard before. I mean, there is a big difference in terms of, if you're actually listening to speech, that difference is there to be perceived if you are going to be bothered. But English speakers mostly don't bother. That is, they don't bother paying attention to the cues that are the amplitude, the ones you saw in the spectrogram and the waveform, the duration of the vowel, the amplitude of the vowel, and the pitch contour of the vowel are all different in a stressed versus an unstressed syllable, but we don't bother with it much in English because it hardly buys us anything. A substantial proportion of the words in which it buys you something were on that slide before. Because, for instance, if now the name of the month, October, right, is the same in English and Dutch, and the name of the creature octopus is the same in English and Dutch. But in English we say octopus, and the second syllable is t, right? And in Dutch they say octopus, right? And the second syllable is to. And when we say October, the second syllable is to in both languages. But in English, the first syllable is October, whereas in Dutch it's op, right? October. And so in Dutch you have a minimal pair of octo versus octo, whereas in English you have octa versus octo, right? So mostly we can tell the difference between words using just the vowels and consonants. We don't have to pay attention, except in a very, very few pairs of words in English where it pays off, but the payoff in Dutch is much, much more, and so Dutch people can make good use of the cues that are in those syllables. Okay, which of course is very useful to them when they're listening to English, because it can help them maybe listen better than in general would be the case in a second language. So we move on. Even at the level of individual speech sounds, this sort of thing happens. Every language, of course, has its own repertoire of speech sounds or phonemes, and some of them really are quite common across languages. I'm going to use an example here. Now, Australia happens to have a remarkable phenomenon that the indigenous languages of Australia are most famous for not having sounds like s and f, but the languages of the world in general are quite fond of having s and f, and they're pretty much pronounced the same across languages. So you see and fee and so on, the distinction is pretty much the same across a lot of languages. But that doesn't mean that everybody's going to do exactly the same thing with these distinctions. And I'm going to show you an experiment which is very simple. And the task is that you just have to respond when you hear a particular sound that you're instructed to listen for. So it might be s, or it might be f. And it's going to be in nonsense. So you might hear doku, bapi, peki, da, tikufa. And so when you hear tikufa, you would press your button because you've been instructed to look for a f. All right? Now, the crucial thing is that all of those target sounds that you're going to be responding to have actually been put into a carrier we've cut up the speech signal and stuck it together again. So originally, if you have a f in tikufa like that, it might have come from another utterance of exactly the same string, or it might have come from tikusa. Now, when you speak, right, the sounds are not uttered completely separately. So I don't say my foot by saying I foot. No, when I'm saying my foot, I'm saying and my teeth are descending towards the lips, my foot, right? As I'm saying the I, or if I'm saying my soot, my teeth are coming together and my lips are spreading as I'm saying the preceding vowel. That makes the preceding vowel subtly a little bit different. We use that stuff, when we're listening. We can listen to a vowel and tell something about the sound that's coming after it. So that in the case of these two nonsense words that you're listening to, one is going to have congruent cues in the surrounding vowels for the f, and the other one is going to have mismatched cues because they're going to cue a s, right? So, actually this is a really old experiment. It was done by my student in Anita Wagner and published in 2006, but it wasn't her original experiment. It was originally done in the 1950s with English speakers, and it's a famous experiment. It's in all the textbooks. And what they were doing at that time, that was when they were just discovering that people were listening to these co-articulatory cues, as we call them in speech. And so they were mapping them systematically. And when they got to looking at the sounds like s and f, they found something really strange that they hadn't expected, namely that the responses to f were always harder to make when the cues in the vowel were mismatching, but the responses to a target s were completely unaffected. It didn't matter where it came from. You were always just exactly as quick or as slow responding to s. So they had these were people at Haskins Laboratories in New Haven, Connecticut, famous speech researchers of the 20th century, the most famous speech researchers of the 20th century, and they had a good explanation for this. They said, well, s is a very, very clear sound, so you don't really need to listen to the vowels around it. And f is a very weak sound, and so maybe you need to listen to the vowels around it. And that went into the textbooks. All the textbooks say that. And my student, Anita, came along and said, I don't think so. She had a good reason for this, which I will tell you, but she did the experiment again. And she got exactly the same result for English. So what I'm going to show you is the mismatch effect. So how much extra difficulty there is for mismatching cues for F than for S. okay, which is big in English, just as they'd found in 1958. And so then Anita went and did it in other languages also, and got the same effect in Spanish. And she went and did it in Dutch. No effect at all in Dutch. I'll tell you, she also did it in German. There was no effect in German. She did it in Italian. There's no effect in Italian. I didn't bother putting them all up there, but they're all the same. So now, question for you. I've omitted one small crucial piece of information. The Spanish listeners were in Madrid. This was Castilian Spanish. Clue. So, what does English have and Castilian Spanish that Dutch, German, and Italian don't have? Oh, you're good. You guys are good. Exactly. So, her suggestion was that the textbooks were all wrong. Hold the press, rewrite the textbooks. The reason that in English and Spanish you need those vowel cues for f is to distinguish it from f, because f and f are famous for being the hardest two sounds to distinguish from one another in English. Okay, but she didn't stop the experiment there. She did it in another language as well. We got that. What does that mean? More effect for S and for F. So it can go right the other way. So what sort of language would that be then? Well, I'll tell you which language it was. It was Anita's native language, Polish. Do we have any Polish speakers? Native Polish speaker? All right, well, would you like to give us these costs? So there are so some are a bit like ch and sh. I mean it's sh. It's these two that I can't listen. Kosh. Kosh. If you're Polish, you have to be able to make that distinction, right? And so you need the information in the vowels, right? So you need the information that the vowels are going to give you about what your teeth and your tongue and the rest of your articulate is actually doing at that moment, coming into the confusable sound. So in every language you get information about consonants in the vowels that are adjacent to them. But you only use it for those particular sounds that it helps you to distinguish, right? So in Spanish and English, that's f versus th, and in Polish, it's s from all the sounds like s in Polish. So thank you very much to our informant in the middle. So we've seen it happen at the relationship between syllables. We've seen it happen at speech sounds and vowels and consonants. And now there's another thing that languages differ widely in, and that's the size of their repertoires of speech sounds or phonemes. And so what I've done here is plot languages from a collection by Madison of representative of the languages of the world. And it's several hundred languages which represent whole language families. And what you see along the bottom is, in groups of 3, the number of actual speech sounds in the language, and then the number of languages with that number. And you see that the average typical kind of language is Mandarin or Spanish with about 25 sounds, vowels and consonants put together, and that Dutch and Korean and English and so on are on the high end of the continuum, especially English, and that's you know, we have over 40 in British and Australian English. It's a lot. It's still not many to make all the words that we know, however. So all languages being like that, having many words but only a handful of phonemes, gives us something that we call a words within words problem, but that's just, it's distinguishing between the various things you're looking for in the speech signal. Now you might ask, what's St John's Church, Darlinghurst in Sydney doing there? Well, that's where I live, actually. I live right opposite St John's Church in Sydney, and if you walk through the churchyard from Darlinghurst Road to Victoria Street, which I do regularly, you'll see a whole lot of little signs that members of the congregation have made and placed there. They seem to have a little local competition about making interesting signs to put in the churchyard. And there's this one, which is absolutely brilliant. Mess in message, test in testimony, trial in trial or triumph, victim or victory. That is exactly what listening is all about. That is what we're doing every day. Because when you have just a handful of phonemes, 25 or even 40, and hundreds of thousands of words in your vocabulary, believe me, you know hundreds of thousands of words, then it is inevitable that there's going to be short words like mess embedded in longer words like message, test in testimony, and similar words. So you're going to be, you have lots of words that begin in the same way or end in the same way, trial or triumph, victim or victory. So that encapsulates the words within words problem, which we all have in all languages, but phoneme repertoire size is going to actually affect that. So if you have fewer phonemes, you're going to have longer words by definition, because you know, if you just have short ones, you're going to run out of phonemes pretty soon. And longer words are then going to allow for more embedded words, because you've got more length, and even without that, just having fewer phonemes will itself produce more spuriously embedded words, because independently of word length, just because of the statistical probability that any sequence of phonemes is going to be a word, which is higher, of course, if you have fewer phonemes. So we compared a very typical vocabulary, namely Spanish, against a very, very unusual one, namely English, with its 44 phonemes. And just as I just said, the average length is shorter in English than in Spanish. So if you look here, the peak of the distribution here is here in English and over here in Spanish. And in fact, the average word length in the vocabulary is less than 7 phonemes in English and over 8 in Spanish. And what does that mean for words within words? Well, on average, now this is averaged across, this is computed for average spoken language. Now, we're taking every word in the vocabulary and multiplying it by its frequency, basically, and then calculating whether there are any words inside it or not. On average, you will have around a word within every other word you're hearing in English, and 2.5 times as many in Spanish. So does that mean that it's really, really hard for Spanish people to listen to Spanish compared with us listening to English? No, it doesn't. Because there's always something you can fall back on. And as it happens with Spanish, Spanish, like English, is a stress language, right? So we might predict that they might make use of that stress cues in listening in the way that we know that English don't bother to. And here's the final experiment I'm going to show you, which is a word recognition experiment. And in this experiment, what we did was we're measuring the time it takes people to recognize a word as a function of having heard a little bit of it first or not. So imagine that given the examples you heard before, that I played to you camp from campus or campaign, and then you heard campaign, and you had to decide whether it was a word or not. So if the bit that you heard actually matched in stress and in phoneme, well, obviously it's got to match in phoneme. So it's going to make you a little bit faster if you already heard a bit of the word, right? Campaign, boom, you're going to be a little bit faster responding, yes, that's a word. And you are, and that works for Spanish, where the examples are, for instance, príncipe, right, which means prince, or principio, which means principle. Okay, so if you hear from principio, and then you hear príncipe, and you have to say yes, that's a word, then that's a mismatching case. And the crucial question that we're asking is not whether you get facilitation when they match, right, which you do in all of these languages, but whether you get inhibition, that is, whether it actually makes you slower when they mismatch. Because if it actually makes you slower when they mismatch in stress alone, then you've obviously been using that information, right? And you've heard prin, and you thought, that's principe, and then, or principio, and then the other one comes in, and you're going to be a little bit slower. And the same in English. So do you get inhibition? Yes, you do in Spanish and in Dutch. So I told you that Dutch can do this. Use stress in word recognition. What about English? What are you predicting? No, nothing. Not significant, no significance at all in the English experiment run in Sydney. So, just as you would predict, the Spanish have something else to help them recognize words that English listeners don't use. So, that was 3 examples. In fact, every aspect of the way we listen to speech is guided by the native language. We looked at speech sounds, we looked at prosodic structure, and we looked at what words are like, and they all affect how we listen, which makes our listening maximally efficient, because this starts really from day one of listening. Maximally efficient for the language that we learned and were shaped to and guided to listen to. It incidentally makes it much harder to listen to second languages that we acquire later, we start acquiring in adulthood, but that is another story. Thank you.
Thank you, and for a lecture that's opened up, I guess, and also made us aware of lots of things that we only dimly suspected. Now, we are going to open the floor for discussion, and Anne will take her own questions. It seems to be the most simple way. So we've got roughly a quarter of an hour, let's say.
Yep.
So please ask.
Bilingual babies, so you have 2 parents both speak different languages. Does that work the same for them? Like, we've got Korean granddaughters, and their parents speak to them both Korean and English. So I'm just wondering, is one going to be harder for them?
In some cases, because it's been looked at. In some cases, we haven't looked at it yet. So we know that what we know is that bilinguals very often do what's best for both of their native languages. Whether they switch or do the maximum amount of work for each language, it wouldn't hurt you to listen to Q's in the vowels for S as well as F in English. No, it wouldn't hurt you at all. Or to listen to F as much as S and Polish. It's just that you don't bother. It wouldn't hurt you to listen to stress in English. What we don't know is whether they do everything, or switch strategies for language. That's actually not known yet, and we are testing at the moment with we're testing speech sounds with bilinguals at the moment. So watch this space. We hope to know that soon. But yes, I mean, in general, growing up bilingual gives you maximal command over more than one language, and it's wonderful, and it keeps your brain healthy all your life, and it's a great thing. So yeah, but we don't know about the subtle mechanics of it. Yeah.
On the graph where you showed how many speech sounds there are in the language, Spanish had less speech sounds than Dutch, right?
Yes, absolutely.
But on the other graph, it seems that Dutch relied more on stress than Spanish. Why is that?
Payoff in the vocabulary for attending to stress cues in minimal pairs is somewhat greater in Dutch than in Spanish, as it happens. But I don't know whether that actually correlates with the size of the effect, because there were different words. They were not particularly chosen for that. The statistical significance of the effect in Dutch and Spanish is roughly the same, and stronger in both cases than the effect in English. Yeah.
The languages that you use as examples are all Western European languages. You've got Mandarin and Korean.
That's science,
Has work been done in other language groups or mixing up language groups?
That's one of the nice challenges that we hope to be able to meet in this centre that's just starting at the moment with processing of indigenous languages. But yes, there's a lot of processing data from a lot of other languages. These particular examples that I gave you were mostly from my own work, although I have also worked on African languages, verbal languages, and a lot on Asian languages also. But there's a lot of data from Asian languages in speech research. There's less from, for instance, I don't know if anybody else has done reaction time experiments in statistics and my colleagues for reaction time experiments on word recognition in Berber either. But the issues we were addressing there are somewhat different and have to do with continuous speech into its component parts, and so I didn't put them in today's lecture. But in those cases, what you find is precisely what you would predict from the structure of the language. So, for instance, with the Berber case, we went and looked at Berber simply because Berber is an extraordinary language phonologically. It allows standalone words without any vowels in them, right? So that the one thing that I could actually utter that my Berber colleague who did this experiment with me taught me was, which is drink it up. Said to his daughter. present. So I thought I could actually imitate that one. And so you can have words without vowels, which made it a very interesting test case for another big package of experiments we have done on the importance of processing vowels and consonants slightly differently while you're listening to speech, which should not have been the case with Berber, and indeed it turned out that Berber was indeed the only counterexample that we've come across in all the experiments that we did. Yeah.
Does this mean that we shouldn't be as concerned that with phonemes being discrete segmental units as we have been traditionally?
Well, I think we're only concerned about phonemes being discrete segmental units in describing them phonologically, right? And they are. I mean, the point about a phoneme is it's the thing that makes soot different from foot.
Yes.
Right? That's phoneme.
But
That's how you just. But there is no way that when we're listening to speech, we are dividing the speech into, oh, I'm hearing a soot, and now I'm hearing a foot, and now I'm hearing a soot. We don't do that.
No, so what I was going to ask you guys, I heard of a study of Portuguese. Have you heard the studies of Portuguese analphabetic?
Yes.
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 Yeah.
My colleagues, Marais and Kalinsky and others who the series of experiments that are referred to again in work on segmenting speech and what do you hear in speech as you're listening to it? Are you hearing segmenting it word by word, syllable by syllable, stress foot by stress foot, and for a lot of languages, well, actually, the answer to that question you can quite easily predict. This is really, really interesting for our reason. You can predict it from the poetic tradition of the language. Yeah. So if you have a language where the poetry has stress rhythm, like English, you can say, okay, stress is going to be important in segmenting speech into its components, and it is, it turns out. And in French, the syllabic structure is what determines poetic forms, and in French, the syllable is the most important unit. And in Japanese, if you're writing writing Japanese poetry, you're using the mora to define the poetic forms, and like haiku or whatever, and indeed the mora in Japanese, which is a subsyllabic unit. I'm giving a whole nother lecture to you. And in Japanese, the mora also determines segmentation. And Portuguese is basically a syllabic language. And in those very old experiments in the 60s, they first thought, oh, well, maybe if they're illiterate, then they don't, they can't hear the phonemes. But in fact, if you do the experiments, if you do the follow-ups of the later series of experiments, you'll see that Portuguese and French are very, very similar. And the syllable is a very important segmentation unit in both cases, and but also individual vowels and consonants behave in the same way as they do.
But it's really hard to get a hold of people who have not been exposed to alphabetic writing systems.
It's true that it's much easier, if you're not a linguist, it's much easier to talk about letters than it is to talk about phonemes. I can tell you. So if you can read an alphabetic system, then you know immediately when somebody tells you, oh, that sound is different, right? And it's very hard to work it out if you can't read it because you know actually intuitively that what you really need to do is decide whether you're hearing triumph or triumph, right? You're choosing between words, right? It doesn't really matter how many syllables they have or how many sounds they have. You want to know which word it is, right? Nevertheless, the only difference between a minimal pair of words like is African influence. Right? So phonologically it's there. Whether it's not there in listening to speech for anybody, Portuguese, Australian English, Russian, Japanese, whatever, nor illiterate or literate, whatever. Nobody does that. Nobody listens to speech phoneme by phoneme in any language. Yeah.
So you talked a lot about learning about your native language. Have you done any studies about if people have, I guess, studied another second language later on in their life, would they then be able to, do they gain more skills in telling differences between phonemes and stress levels and things, or are they kind of always hindered by what they were born with?
Actually, there's a lot of individual differences there. That is one of the big new growth areas. We're just finding out that there are, especially with learning a second language later on, some early measures in childhood can predict your later success in that. Everybody learning a unrelated language. Now, I started learning Dutch in my 40s, but it's so like English. I got pretty good. I speak it with a very, very bad accent, bad English accent, and I'll never be native. But I got much better than, for instance, if I had started learning Mandarin or Japanese at the same age. I would never been able to do as well then. So there's a whole lot of different parameters on which it works. But whatever, people who learn a second language later in life say there are some things which are always harder. So listening noise, right? It's always easier in your first language. We're testing that now in Sydney too. There's people like Dutch people who emigrated to Australia and only speak English and they're looking to see whether nativeness or dominance is stronger. Yeah.
So this follows on from that question. Is there an effect if the child starts learning at a fairly young age?
Yes. The younger you learn, the more native you are. I mean, you start with multiple languages in the home. You're very often just as good in one as in the other, and usually you'll have some kind of area in which you only use one language and another one sort of isn't natural, but they balance out. So you're going to be you can be multilingual. The more the merrier. So it's good for your brain. Yes.
I was going to ask you just how early on we talked about the features for the baby being able to understand English, right?
They don't understand.
No,
They don't understand. But they recognize gross patterns. Like, for instance, one of the things that's been shown, I said that stress languages, English and Dutch are very, very similar. Up to about 2 months of age, English learners and Dutch learners can't tell the difference between English and Dutch, right? So they'll happily listen to either because they sound pretty.
Yeah.
They really are very, very similar. But they can tell either of them from Italian or Japanese or Portuguese.
But in that sense, so later, if you talk more about adaptation education and in an environment where children are being taught or are in an immersion environment where say they are being spoken to all day in a particular language such as Italian and it's not their native tongue and they're being spoken in English at home,
the world has given us a multitude of examples. And in this, I mean, you should talk to this guy. I mean, he will give you many, many examples. In much of the world, and including much of Australia, outside of our artificially westernized language areas, bilingualism is the norm. Multilingualism is the norm. I mean, you don't speak exactly the same language as the guys down in the village down the road. And so you need to learn that language too to talk to them. And then there's another village up there which has another language, and so you learn that too. And I mean, you do, because up until you're 20 or something, you get pretty much like that. And that's normal. And we are deprived. We who haven't been exposed to that, we're deprived. Our brains have been deprived of this healthy mechanism which keeps us cognitively active, more active in old age. True. That's some of the most astounding things that have been shown in recent years. That people who speak multiple languages all their life, if they're going to get Alzheimer's, they get it about 5 years later. Hey, isn't that worth doing?
Yes, I speak both German and English.
What do you? Sort of like this. Sorry.
What language do you easiest to learn?
Dutch. But actually learning a very different language is a nice cognitive challenge. Sorry?
Sorry.
Learning a very different language is a nice cognitive challenge, but if you want a language that an English and Dutch speaker take another Germanic language.
Yes, but Germanic.
Yes, Dutch, Norwegian. Yeah.
What other language has the stress on the first syllable that, for instance?
Interesting. Yes, German and Dutch, and I didn't actually say that. But the stress, there is an overwhelming tendency in English and in Dutch and in German for stress to fall on the first syllable. Yes. And what other language has stress on? Nick, what non-Germanic language has a tendency towards stress on the first syllable? Czech. Okay. Try Czech. Asian languages don't have stress like Indonesian, of course, but it's not.
Just about any indigenous language as well.
Yes, indigenous languages have. That's right.
Initial stress, despite the way they're usually pronounced in English.
Aranda, Murin, Baffa, they have a stress. They have initial stress in general. Yeah, that's just giving you language names. So, there are some online courses in Australian indigenous languages which Nick highly recommends.
I'm thinking it's probably time to draw the discussion to a close as people drift out.
Yeah,
but there's, before thanking Anne, there's one thing I want to do. We're very grateful that so many people have come and engaged with the discussion. And this is the beginning of 7 years of what we hope is a sort of growing crescendo of dialogue between research on language and interest by the public and by people who work with language. And we want to reach as many people as possible. Now, we assume that you got this information in a variety of ways, but if you aren't currently on our mailing list, please, and would like to hear more, please email coedl@anu.edu.au. That's CoEDL@anu.edu.au. Very soon we'll have a regular newsletter going out, and then you'll be in touch with all the activities we have. Yeah.
What's the name of Professor Cutler's book?
When you put it,
It's
native listening, and it's just come out in paperback.
yes. Okay. Yeah.
MIT Press.
Okay. So at this point, please join me in thanking Anne Cutler for giving such a great inaugural. CoEDL. CoEDL. Centre of Excellence Dynamics Language. Yeah.